Yes, exactly. So actually,
I'm sorry, we are a little late.
you don't make mistakes.
Sorry?
I said you don't make mistakes.
Sometimes. A lot of times, that's it.
Do I need a microphone? Do I need a microphone?
Do you need? You say.
Well, I'm asking. Do you think I need some?
I don't know. You probably will ask you. And
Yeah,
you say how
people
you
always say that they don't need it. Blah, 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 blah. Oh, you don't have one of these to put on.
No, actually, this is the problem. We are not sure what is going to happen.
Okay.
We're going to try. O computador para qual ele não? Essa do Spring. Não da Power. Essa do Power. Ah, essa do Power. Desse tudo? Upload.
Yeah, it's live.
Esse é o meu documento. Deixa eu ver. Vou ligar a força que vai ter um outro problema. Aqui, vou ligar isso aqui.
Good morning, everybody here. On behalf of our scientific committee, organized committee of our third International Colors and Numbers, Ways of Enaction, I would like to welcome you all here for Fortaleza. It's very nice, very helpful and proud to see all of you here. People from different areas, from different countries, interacting in Fortaleza. I'm very happy with this possibility to talk about activism, and this new books by Mine, and then throughout these 3 days of discussion. Thank you for coming and for an interest in coming here. We're living in a very difficult time in Brazil for getting money for scientific events. So it's a victory. We got something like that here. A great victory, and there's a teamwork victory. Because without the help of several people here, this. I would like to say a great thank you to Carlos Grito and Francisco Pereira for, embracing the idea of this event and making all the efforts, producing the effort to bring this conference to Fortaleza, for the Federal University of Ceará. This joint work between Fortaleza and Alagoas. I used to live in Fortaleza, and then I changed my city to Maceió, Alagoas. Brazil, but kind of far away. Without that kind of help, this wouldn't have been possible. So let me talk about this field. I'd like to take all this computer science program here from the Federal University of Ceará. They were a major help with this hotel, with the airplanes, the tickets, to this actually said, and the Brazilian Society for Analytical Philosophy, which is also this kind of work with Hutto, and then Hutto is in Rio de Janeiro. Mine was in Chile, then Hutto as well, and then here, Glenda Satini, and my work is the Dare and conference, and also this coordination for improvement of the higher educational level, which is our campus. They founded this event. This conference calls and others, the idea was the first conference was in 2013, and was dedicated to evaluating why the first book by Wittgenstein, the Tractatus about philosophers, didn't work. Okay? And interesting enough, there are 2 main problems occurring in this first philosophy of Wittgenstein, which is number qualities. How can we express linkage or relations between these numerical systems? And then the idea of giving a conference was not just to address these tiny problems, but also address a lot of language, logic, a lot of mathematics here in Northeast part of Brazil, connecting people from analytical philosophy to people from continental philosophy, talking about phenomenology. The second great conference was in 2015, where we talked not about numbers and not about colors. The topic was how colors get to philosophy. We are fortunate enough to get 2 main publications from these books. One, the 2 will be are published this year. The first one is Scholars in the Development of Wittgenstein's Philosophy by Paul Grave. And another one is this one, How Colors Matter to Philosophy. This one is more general about philosophy, mathematics, logic, philosophy, epistemology, philosophy of mind, so several topics in contemporary philosophy. Okay? And this is our website for this event, for this 3rd edition in 2017. We are here trying to cooperate with several groups from Chile, from Belgium, and from Australia, and other discourse groups in Brazil. So this event was planned also to motivate this kind of cooperative work in Brazil too, because we have several different works or groups here working with activism and this kind of recognition, but we do not really know each other. So it's a pity, it's a problem. So this conference was about to advance this kind of make connection, make cooperative projects. Just two logistics. Yeah? Every change in the program, please go to the website, this website, and see. This is our kind of reference. So we just send some programs there. Okay? But every change will be back on the website. So please keep attention, pay attention to the website. For today, we're going to open with this presentation. We're going to have a second talk by Manuel, that's Ivan, and Carlos here. All three are here. We're going to have lunch, and we have we made a little change in the program. So we're going to decide to give you a longer period of lunch so we can enjoy a little bit the city and the beach and something like that because it's sunny and a very pleasant. So we're going to have some more minutes and 30 minutes more to go to the room and go to the top of the building. There's a beautiful pool there as well. So enjoy yourselves, and then we come every afternoon up to we're going to begin every afternoon on at 4 p.m. Okay? Today, we're going to have a talk by Gabriel Grave, and then we're going to go directly to the book lounge. Okay? The new book is evolving in activism, and development. And the dynamics, I will represent this group here in Fortaleza, then Manuel agora in Rio de Janeiro. We're going to present very shortly the book and then take some questions and pass through to the book. Okay? So this is the program for today, and please keep some time for some informal meeting just after the presentations here, so we can eat something together, drink some beer, and continue talking about philosophy because make fun. It's great fun. So let's keep in mind, every question that we have, any problems with the city and with the schedule, everything that we can help with, please do not hesitate to come and talk to me, Mark, and Carlos. We can be more than happy to help you. So here I will pass the book to Daniel Rufo, and we will just switch. Let's see. Okay. I mean, it's not. We do not have to make a long presentation, but it's very, very, very happy to have you here. Thank you for coming. Very good to be a professor of philosophical psychology at the University of Wollongong in Australia, and we will present a talk here about these several works in philosophy, psychology, philosophy, language. Here we'll be handling the hard problem with kinky.
Add my thanks to everyone. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay. I want to thank especially Marcus. Of course, he's been spearheading this whole, as you can see, it's very appropriate for rec and evolving in activism that we have a multi-stranded, kind of dispersed and dynamic arrangement amongst all these groups of which he spoke. So I won't spend more time right now thanking each and every one of them, because it will take a fair bit of time, but I am grateful to you all and the efforts that you've made to launch the book, and to MIT as well for having sent some materials. So yes, I think let's get right to it. I will take us into this question. So we'll begin a little bit in the middle of the book. This is a program of work with both Eric, of course, but also with Glenda Satney, who is now based in Chile, originally. We have a project for there is a background of the first book. So I will acquainting you, if you haven't got a hard problem of content as we conceive of it, which was the signature idea in the prequel to the current book. And what we began to address more seriously is a number of criticisms that arose about the consistency of our position. There's some confusions. I think some people, as you see, thought that we were out and out content deniers because we have made a claim about the idea that the roots of cognition, as I'll explain in a moment, are content involved. So it is possible, we claim, to have cognition without content. An outrageous thesis for many people. An outrageous idea. For many people in the field, cognition and content just go together like, I don't know, bread and butter. But more essentially than that.
Love and marriage.
What? Love and marriage. That'll be better. Love and marriage. There we are. That's a very romantic view of the world, very good. But the thing is that that challenging idea never led us to the idea that there wasn't any content at all, or indeed cognition wasn't sometimes content involved. And that's our special, and that's actually captured in the subtitles of both books. The first one being just to establish the possibility that there could be basic book subtitles meaning is really the idea that given that some minds do are capable of thinking contentedly, and there's a lot of scope for figuring out exactly what that means, but let's hold steadfast to the idea that there will be this property of some minds, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. You then get the tension between these two factors, where there's a job of work. And so I'm going to spend a little time, and this is really a protocol enough for future work and projects. So often we leave things, more work to be done. We tend to be always not less. So it's never as if the project is finished, it's always another step in the project. But we want to make an argument both that it's a doable project and it's actually a valuable project. So this is what this first talk will be all about. So let me just take you through some preliminaries. In case, of course, you haven't or don't remember what the arguments were concerning the hard problem of content. So this recaptures much of what I just said, or recapitulates it, so just so you can get a grip of it. Radically inactive, embodied account of cognition, and I will use this term endlessly, so please try to hang on to it. There's only a few of these, but they're important. Rec, that's what we call position, and we're easy on whether the E is interpreted as embodied, as long as embodied is interpreted as inactive, in kind of a much older sense of emotion. So that's the signature view, and that's the title for the position that we defend. It understands basic minds to be extensional and relational, extensive and relational, as reaching out to the environment, and not in representational terms. But it also assumes that content involving forms of cognition exists. So when we use the term representational there, I'm thinking of states having representational mental content in a very specific sense. We'll come back to that. The other thesis is that, yes, there are nevertheless forms of content involving cognition, and they're not the most basic in the sense of foundational, fundamental, right? Or you could take basic here as essential. So mind that it have content. So that's a thesis that we've been challenging for some time. Hence, recognize automatically that cognition is uniform in this respect, that it always involves content, that is the essential property of all cognition. Cognition doesn't always and everywhere involve representational content, and in our view, not at its roots. In this respect, Rec rejects unrestricted kick, the thesis of unrestricted kick, which is simply the thesis that content involves cognition always and everywhere. And that is, in some sense, the essence of what is at our mind. There's different ways of defending this notion. We could get into that with the analytic philosophers in the audience, between whether you wanted to try to defend such a thing on purely analytic grounds, a priori. That, of course, takes you into conflict with methodological naturalism. We'll say more about that. But you could even try to defend this as an established fact, a posteriori. But if you did this, you'd have to give your arguments for why we should believe such a thing. And I think many people in at least large quarters of the analytic philosophy of mind and the open science community assume the truth of this thesis, which is why, if we're right, this is a non-trivial result. Unrestricted gig holds, as I said, that it is always and everywhere the case that all cognition involves content of some kind. And that the very idea, if you think otherwise, then you're talking about some other topic, not cognition, but behavior or something else. It's what the mark of the mental or the mark of the cognitive. So its credo is no cognition without content, and that's treated as an analytic truth or discovered a posteriori, as I said, either way. Now, just to motivate this, I'm just using the notion of content, mental representation of content, in a very broad sense. Often one thing to correct, and we hope to correct. We use the standard example because it comes up in literature in the first book often, but not universally. We also talk about other forms of satisfaction condition like accuracy and veridicality, but we usually focus on propositional content because that's the one that philosophers typically use and have used. But that is simply an example for us, and I think that is also made clear in several statements, even in the first book, but it is often been overlooked. And I want to stress this because this is usually argued that the position, if you take a weak notion of content, that you can meet our objections, but I think that's not true. The worry we have concerns any content that involves satisfaction conditions of any kind. A specified way the world has to be such that the world may not be that way. Whether you want to understand that in terms of accuracy, veridicality, propositionality, or what you will. Of course, that means that we're in conflict then with non-conceptual representational content. People who propound such things, okay? So the view is not friendly to those positions. It's saying there's something amiss with those positions just as much as with much more standard, old school language of thought theories and the like. And Travis, I think, captures that well. The condition here is tied to saying things are being thus and so, wherefore all that things need not be that way, however you want to unpack the question. Okay? Obviously, a variety of states might exhibit, or attitudes might exhibit this kind of property. So, unrestricted kicks has a particular explanatory challenge. And this is what we usually focus on when we claim it can't meet this challenge. Or at least we have no reason to believe, given all that we currently know, that it will meet this challenge. And we're very clear that we're not ruling out the possibility. This is not to rule out the mere possibility that these problems would ever be solved, but we are raising the idea all we know and everything we do know suggests that they won't be solved. And that job is set out well by Dredske. It's to provide, without any gaps, a framework for understanding how meaning can evolve, how genuine cognitive systems can develop out of lower order, purely physical information processing mechanisms. And the idea is that we want a story that takes us right from these information processing mechanisms up to meaning. And that's been the game for anyone who thinks that cognition involves content, even in its lowest rungs. So here's Dredske, and here's one of the standard candidate explanations of how we go. In the beginning, there was information. The world came later. The word came later. Sorry. Information, something that does not require or in any way presuppose interpretive processes. So information is something that comes before and below and is primitive with respect to these interpretive activities where we might find content. And the constellation of mental attitudes that exhibit it are manufactured products. The raw material is information. And so the challenge here is to start with some notion of information, forget or anyone who has an explanatory and naturalistic agenda. And this is where our problem comes in. Although people have long recognized the distinction between the purely informational and the representational, we want to say that these kind of stark resources, we don't have these story, this prospects of telling the story, if we make certain assumptions about the nature of information and other properties that are scientifically respectable, powerful, and seemingly impossible to deal with if you only limit yourselves to the resources of certain sciences, as people have been trying to do for the longest time. Content, or the HPC, is the problem of explaining the natural origins of content using only respectable scientific resources. Most promising suspects of these would be covariant information, biological functions, or these in some combination. Of course, there were many others on the list for those who know the history of analytic philosophy in the 1980s and 90s, such as Fodor's views on causation and counterfactual style analyses, but we needn't get into all of the failed attempts that have been played out before us. The most promising usually turn out to be something in the territory of appeals to biological function alongside something like covariant information in response to it. So any kicker, anyone who's in the business of defending unrestricted kick, explanatory naturalism, is obliged to solve the hard problem while abiding to what we call, borrowing from Mike Wheeler, a model constraint. They have to show us, without gaps, in round terms, there's no magic in the story. That they're posing, for example, what they want to explain. And this was the problem. And that requires paying explanatory debts without, in the end, positing content primitive. Of course, if you weren't interested in this project whatsoever, but if you wanted to explain how we get minds, how we get content into the world, the many philosophers, etc. Now, Reck's verdict is that no currently available credible theory of content has delivered anything close to these style solutions. So we don't have that solution at hand. Those that come close still fail, right? So here's an example, it's like coming close in horseshoes is still not hitting the mark. And not hitting the mark here, we don't have a working theory, something that might turn out to be a working theory. We simply have a failed theory. So it's for us, whether you've got this solution or you don't. I'll say more about the following short draft of the book launch tonight when I spend, but I'm not really interested in this is actually still just stage setting for what I want to do. In this paper, proponents of unrestricted case currently lack a naturalistic account of the origins of content, informational, representational, upon which they're theorizing, which they can ground their theorizing about basic minds. So the idea is, if you assume that basic minds, the most simple kinds of minds, are already contentful, we still don't have anything like a fully naturalized account. It's workable to explain how that can be so. Like the hard, until the hard problem is solved, we don't have any compelling reason to believe that at root, cognitive systems or their subparts literally traffic in informational content or represent the world contentedly. I mean, in all sorts of theory, and the idea that we don't need these solutions in order to make those assumptions. We can talk about why I think that's also not a satisfactory answer to the question. But insofar as we are interested in this, it is of importance that we don't have these explanations. Okay, so we've laid this up as a problem. If you start out with notions like covariant information, which is scientifically respectable in particular, content there, and we don't have any way of thinking that if we add something like biological functionality to it, that we've somehow now transformed that into a form of content, or that representational in the sense that's required. Again, I can talk more about this book launch. I think this is the background. But here's the interesting part for our paper today. Isn't it the case? So when we don't have any content in our story about cognition, the basic forms, we don't have to deal with this problem because we simply say there's a different way around it. We don't have an issue. But But surely our opponents, some of our opponents or erstwhile friends or friends who are happy with the critique of the traditional theories but unhappy with the answer we give on the idea that there is content involved in cognition as well, will say, surely the hard problem for our opponents is equally a problem for us. We also have to explain, if we allow for the content, where it comes up in the natural world. And Recker's hold, after all, that some thoughts and linguistic utterances are contentful in the full-bodied sense of exhibiting familiar semantic properties such as reference and truth, that recognizing the contentful character of some thought language is required to explain prominent features of some cognitive activity, for example, be able to think and infer and make thoughts and refer to people or objects or things. We have to have those properties, and that enables us to do all sorts of cognitive acts and complete them, which otherwise we would not be able to. So we accept that thesis as well. And we also hold that it's possible in principle to explain the origins of content involving cognition in a scientifically respectable gapless way. So given that we hold all of these things, how do we handle the problem that we identified as plaguing that of the other accounts that we mentioned? Now, I won't get into any detail here for this talk about the possible solution. We would want to move in the direction of a neo-pragmatist, pick up some threads out of the neo-pragmatist tradition, and Recker's there proposing that the primary bearers of content are semantically articulated symbols occurring in appropriately dynamic patterns where that appears in socio-cultural practices. So we want to say that when we get the appropriate socio-cultural practices arising, we begin to find the beginnings of the kind of cognitive friction and contrast that are required for the ability to think, to make claims, and to think true thoughts. And there's a long tradition of philosophy, of course, that embraces these kind of ideas, and they're familiar enough. So here, Records seek to explain how contentful states of mind develop through processes, for example, of engaging in these established socio-cultural practices. And of course, that's a quite complicated project to explain how we can get to that through cumulative cultural evolution, mechanisms that enable us to coordinate collective forms of intentionality that don't presuppose content, and so on. So that's quite a long, protracted adventure to spell out all that detail. So, for example, to take an example, Holden in 1998 proposed that mechanisms of conformity to social norms lie at the heart of culturally scaffolded processes emerge. We would want to elaborate and develop on that kind of idea. So this is not to give you the details, but to suggest where we hope to find the kind of answer that we'd be looking for, but in a naturalistic tone. Often many of the authors, particularly Brandom and others who have tried to do this, haven't always spelled this out in a way that's been embraced these kind of naturalistic traditions at all, and we suspect that's possible. So that, to put it, advertise it, is the kind of work that Glenda and I have begun to do in some of our recent papers, and indeed probably that will follow up in a whole book-length project in itself. Okay. Records hold that some minds, a subset, have benefited from the right kind of social cultural scaffolding, are therefore content involving minds. That's the supposition. The program is to spell that out in detail. Yet, it's argued that if the hard problem of content has force, that it must affect any and all naturalistic theories of content equally. So the problem that we just raised about worries about trying to get from a state where there is no content in the world, just information understood as covariance and responses to that, how on earth did we get to a stage where we can avoid the hard problem that we have raised and identified for others? Hence, in seeking to apply the hard problem only selectively, Records have been accused of being inconsistent, of ignoring the true scope and force of the hard problem of content itself, right? So it seems like the story is something like this. We raise this as a problem for our opponents, and then conveniently forget about the force of the problem when it comes to actually try to advance our own positive theory. I want to try and demonstrate that we don't have an inconsistency in our project. That either the hard problem is harmless for everyone, and therefore can be conveniently put aside for everyone, or it's a universal acid that destroys any and all naturalized theories of content, including Rex proposed socio-cultural scaffolded account of the natural order. Either or on the standard evaluation. Here's Larry Shapiro making this sort of point. If the hard problem spells doom for contentful thinking, it ought to spell doom for as well for our abilities to understand and use language, in the sense that if we think that coming into language is going to give us the basis for contentful account, as we did suggest, then it seems that we are doomed from the beginning. If you know about this sort of thing, I don't know, this is like being hoisted by your own petard. A petard is a French siege engine used to blow things up, and being hoisted by your own petard is getting caught in your coattails when you're setting a bomb up. So we set up a devastating bomb, and then we forget to detach it from the back end of our clothing as we walk away, as is happening to this poor Frenchman here. It's always exciting to watch. So Rex's reply is that there is no inconsistency in holding the hard problem is hard, or even impossible, a problem for some, but not for other explanatory naturalists. This is our simple response to this objection. How is that supposed to be so? Well, we would suggest different resources yield different explanatory prospects. So the idea that we have to restrict ourselves to too limited a set of resources, say biological functionality and covariance or the like, is of course going to mean that we can't answer the question if our analysis is correct, and it would be perhaps impossible to answer it using those tools, while when we expand the set of tools that we want to use for understanding the origins of content, our prospects shift and change and become a more reasonable project. So that's our answer to this seemingly deep inconsistency. So the answer is something like this. The hard problem of content is only impossibly hard for naturalists who limit themselves to using narrow resources when trying to explain how content comes into being, or how meaning evolves. So those sort of theorists are trying to get water out of a stone by squeezing very hard, and this may not in fact be achievable. So we don't think that that's something we can do, but that's what we've identified there. More pragmatically put, we bring in another set of resources that aren't just limited to the covariant information and the purely biological functions, but we bring in this whole raft of cultural evolution, of niche, cultural niches, scaffolding, a whole range of extra items that we think would enable us to add to those sets of resources and therefore build a better bridge to get across this problem. So I don't think there's anything here that should surprise anyone who's of a naturalist mindset. There's nothing that this is not a hard problem in the sense of David Chalmers style metaphysical hard problem, which means that the hard problem is impossible to deal with for anyone, which is I think what people have assumed. What we think is that you could expand your set of resources to deal with it. Now, okay, so now that introduces another set of strategies. We need to deal with two responses to this, which I'll get to. So there's two responses that people make to this often to suggest that we haven't got out of the difficulty. And that's to advance a kind of very general argument for having to use restricted resources if you're a naturalist. So that answer might sound plausible, except for the fact that if you say, well, look, if you're any decent naturalist, you're not allowed to help yourself to more resources, right? You have to stay on a limited set of resources. And if that's the case, then of course you haven't been able to solve the problem. So we could say something like, all good naturalists must subscribe to an uncompromising reductionist unification agenda. And if that's the case, we don't want to be going up into appeals to anthropology, social aspects of our being, because we need to restrict what we do when we explain naturalistically. Now, on that model, reductionist explanations are required of any phenomena for it to qualify as bona fide natural. And there's some stricter than others. I have listed some strict naturalists, but I'm going to stick with Rosenberg because he's the most salient example of a very, very strict naturalist. So wreckers, being explanatory naturalists, have no choice but to use the restricted resources of the hard sciences, biology, or maybe even ultimately just physics, right? So we shouldn't help ourselves to an expansive set of resources to explain this problem. This is the kind of statement you get from people who are really subscribing to very strict forms of naturalism in this way. Reality contains only the kinds of things that the hard sciences recognize. Natural science requires unification. 1 + 2 = 0 tolerance for any phenomena in a given domain that won't reduce to the hard sciences. So if you start making appeal to these other dimensions as really the key to understanding the origins of content, you've already given up your naturalist credentials if you have this really restrict club membership. So the bouncer here isn't going to let you in with these kind of extra items in order to deal with this problem. Here's Rosenberg, for example, making these kind of claims. Science can't accept interpretation as providing knowledge of human affairs if it can't, at least in principle, be absorbed into, perhaps even reduced to, neuroscience. He wants them to break down fully into, ultimately, into physical science. That would be the ultimate dream of this enterprise, as it's been around for some time. Now, I'm not going to develop a long, not today certainly, a long argument against this. There are plenty of philosophers who do argue against this all the time, and notably, Rosenberg and Williamson, even in the New York Times, battled out all the while over whether or not the kind of project that's being proposed by Rosenberg even makes sense. I mean, there's a couple of formal arguments, of course, that Williamson uses, which we can rehearse and discuss later. I don't want to delay. I simply think this is not, if you expose this as the reason not to take seriously the REC program, I think most sympathies lie with those who think that, in fact, we can use a more expansive set of explanations without violating any kind of naturalism. And here's Williamson's point. He says, if naturalists turn out to be what they count as science, naturalism loses its credibility anyway, right? So it's his view. He has a number of very formal arguments about the fact that if you make this claim, it's kind of a familiar version of the logical positivist problem. We have to make some claim about there being truths that aren't discoverable by the hard sciences, and one of them will be that the hard sciences explains all discoverable truths. And so there's some nice, neat moves that can be made here as well. But even putting that aside, to say that there is no explanatory value, say even in the biological or the cultural sciences, seems very fast, and we need a very strong argument. And I won't worry about this myself until we see those arguments played out. There are other additional arguments that could be raised about the norms here themselves coming from extra scientific demands. You might think that that demand of unification is not something that arises in physics itself per se, but comes from more philosophical agendas that associate. So I think there's lots of ways that one might respond to this in a longer form answer. But that suggests that if that were alone the issue, we might just be a little bit more expansive in the range of things following Williamson's view and not worry too much about this particular general argument. Now is that there's a more specific argument that I think it does more of the work. So I don't think most people, I'm not saying all, but I don't think most people are terribly persuaded by this argument that they can't do its job. But this other argument, I think, is extremely persuasive. And it probably does a lot of work, and I want to expose it as full. And this is a more restricted version of the argument. So this is a special argument for the restricted naturalism. So here, the idea is something like this. Relaxed naturalists, that's what we call ourselves, so we're quite no worries naturalists, take a socio-cultural phenomena to be wholly natural and hence legitimate resources that can be used to account for the natural origins of content. So we can use them as explanans, and we take the target explanandum as content. We think that we can help ourselves to those kind of properties without worry. Yet, some argue, and I think this is the argument, some argue that the stated restrictions on naturalism's legitimate explanatory resources are necessary because of special features of this particular explanation and this particular explanandum. So the familiar argument is something like this. Resource is used in any naturalist explanation of content because content has to be in place before any socio-cultural practices could have appeared on the scene, anything that could count as a socio-cultural practice at all, anyway. Why would that be so? Because that would present us with a real puzzle. Well, this is the kind of thing. external symbols acquire their meaning from meaningful thoughts. How could it be otherwise? And the how could it be otherwise, of course, is the force that I want to draw out. These, even in the body of what allegedly are purely naturalistic arguments, we get a lot of these conceivability or imaginability remarks, or what I call sometimes inferences from lack of imagination. So an inference from a lack of imagination is I can't imagine how it could possibly be otherwise, and then we get this kind of statement. And the idea here is that the symbols that we're relying on to explain the origins of content must get their meaning from the mental states that enable you to give expression to them. In that familiar view, you can find the same kind of statements, of course, in Fodor many times over. That kind of familiar view would rule out the possibility of looking to social culture practices as part of the story of how content arises in the first place. So external symbols cannot be meaningful independently of the thoughts that they've been designed to express. So the symbols can't help to be part of the story upon which we develop this capacity. And so that's the special argument. So it's not some general reason about social cultural practices, it's that they come in a form that makes it impossible to give the explanation of the sort we want. So the master argument is something like this: a workable naturalistic account of social cultural origins and content is not possible if participating in master social cultural practices requires cognition, which we accept. Cognition entails intentionality, which we accept. And finally, intentionality entails content, which we don't accept, of course. But that standard role of thinking, for most people, rules out the possibility of giving this kind of explanation. What's interesting, of course, is that is the very thesis that Reck propounds. It's the third thesis that we've been trying to make sense of. And indeed, flipping it the other way, we say that we don't have a story of the most basic forms of intentionality from our opponent theories. We don't have what's holding up the field for a long time. So, an explanatory problem will arise for anyone who equates content with intentionality and who also holds this quote from Hoagland himself. Original intentionality is essentially a social institution, where this entails that not only specific types of thought, but thought in general depends on language. So someone who holds these kind of views in combination, this is actually from Barth, but you get the same kind of thing in expanding on the Hoagland idea. There is no room for whatever for original intentionality in any animals, asocial robots, or even isolated beings. And if this is the case, we can't understand how they could have got into the making of the practices without already having contentful cognition to enable this to happen. So does that actually spell doom for Reck's chances of explaining the natural origins of content in the way that we hope to? Well, it would, as long as the pivotal assumption, one made by almost everyone in the game, remains in place. And now if we spell it out, the offending assumption, which I'll call ick, is that, quote, to have intentionality is to have semantic content, something that, at least in this quote, we find Hoagland entertaining. So if you take those two things to be the case, then there is an impassable problem. Now, I think the only way in the game that we do, the only way in the game to move it along is to deny that intentionality always and everywhere entails content. But now I refer you back to the opening slide. That was the thesis that we were propounding and defending all the way through. So it's not an ad hoc response. This is actually a feature or the approach that we've been pushing. Indeed, I think that requires distinguishing intentionality is not just a single uniform thing, as we said, just as we did with cognition. So we have to distinguish, say, target-based from intentionality that is construed as content involving. And I can say a lot more, and we say a lot more about that in the book. This is the solution for getting around this. Selectionist explanations, therefore, won't deliver a theory of content, perhaps, as such, but they can tell us what particular sort of device, in fact, targeted, and thereby what determines the range of things that descendant devices now respond to, extensionally speaking, and why they do so. So that's basically the teleosemiotic account, which is a modified version of Millikan that we propound in the book. We think it doesn't give you a theory of content per se, but it gives you enough to getting on with the idea that you can have interactions and engagements with other minds without assuming, you could assume how you could come into practices and how they could get off the ground without assuming content as a primitive. And so avoids this particular problem. And I think it's not unreasonable. Here's a recent paper by Muller. If we want an account of intentionality that's both informed by evolutionary biology and consistent with the tenets of naturalism, nuanced understanding of intentionality. And the nuance here is that we don't have a singular story all the way through. And indeed, naturalistically minded philosophers ought to be skeptical of the idea that representation has one single common essence anyway, just like many other phenomena. So we shouldn't be surprised to find that there are a variety of forms of intentionality. Not all of them have the same properties. I think this is, you know, an idea that's starting to emerge. So to capture this the position that we have is structurally similar to that of Hugh Price, where he says that this. He talks of two notions of representation that should be properly kept apart and not, as he puts it nicely, clumsily put together. It takes some effort to see that two notions of representation might flow free of one another, but I think it's an effort worth making. The distinction between these two notions of representation is on the table. It's open to regard the two notions as having different applications for various theoretical purposes. And of course, he's talking here very much in the Rex spirit. Representation, or the notion that it's just causal covariance and tracking, versus the one that involves properties like being able to have be evaluative in terms of truth conditions and such like. So that's the divide, and that matches precisely what Reck is suggesting. The only difference is we're kind of good Frege-ians, and we don't really want to call them both representations of different. We think that there's intentionality of a kind that lacks content, which would fit this perfectly, and then there are other forms of cognition that have content. So this is not an entirely unheard of view, although often it's not, perhaps for some people, hang on to the notion of total representation, where we would not for various reasons. We think it lacks those properties precisely. Okay. All right, hopefully, I hope now I've persuaded you that at least that project is logically possible. It's not dead in the water from the beginning, that we're not, in fact, inconsistent, and that the hard problem, although I think hard for some, is not equally hard for all. But that's as far as I've got. I'm going to spend a little time now taking you through. I'm going to try to be quick, but one other objection that has been raised, and that is that we've split nature asunder, which sounds bad for a theory, the naturalistic theory. That in fact, that our position, even if we get this far, yields an unbridgeable gap in nature. So a number of raised. They say basic mind should not be characterized as representational, but language users take on some of the representational capacities of the language, and they call this a salation count. So on a salationist view, it's only added on as a consequence of using language, narrative, or possibly some other social resources. So these authors claim this idea of a kind of duplex story in which the social brings in this new dimension, this new capacity for content of all the thinking, splits things asunder. In particular, Reck is alleged that he introduces a chasm, quote, a chasm between enhanced and more basic minds. So the idea is that there's this unbridgeable gap, even if our story isn't blocked on it for the reasons I gave a moment ago. Bad result. And once such a chasm is introduced, we can rule out any possibility of providing a naturalistic explanation of the origins of content in terms of gradual, continuous change of the sort evolutionary explanations favor. So our problem isn't now so much that it's impossible or that we've brought our own doom on with the hard problem. We've introduced some discontinuity into the heart of the story about nature that goes against evolutionary theories. And they're not alone in making this complaint. Even my erstwhile friend, Richard Minari, says, bridging the gap between basic cognitive processes and enculturated ones, since they think that meaning or content can only be present in cognitive systems when language and cultural scaffolding is present. So that's just repeating back what I suggested was our of a solution. That, of course, he says, doesn't sit well with evolutionary continuity. So it's a painful position to have. Tension, well, resides in this kind of very, very famous quote from Darwin. The man and higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not kind. And the idea is that in introducing these different properties, we've introduced the difference in kind that destroys evolutionary continuity. So this commitment to this particular commitment to how naturalism should be understood like that. Okay. So what can we do about that? What can we say? Standard solution, which I'll talk about in a moment in different forms, is assume psychological continuity between human and non-human animals. So you just have that original point. You don't want a continuity problem, so you your elaboration all the way over. We won't have an issue. Okay, but there's a consequence to this view, which I'll spell out in a moment. A gapless evolutionary continuity is secured if we assume fundamental psychological continuity in all cognizers, all the way up, all the way down, whatever exact properties we insert into that story. And these actually are the most popular views. I think this almost takes the whole field apart from the reposition. I'll say something about that, one way or another. So a popular solution is a positive sliding scale of content that's linked with increasing flexibility of response. This is very popular. So this idea. Types of interactions can be understood as falling along a continuum. On-semantic end, we have interactions that are best explained in terms of these. On the semantic end, we have interactions that are best explained in terms of their semantic properties, and they run in that along that continuum. So actually spelling that out a little bit, giving as an example, drawing on consumer-based telesemantics, for example, it's been argued that the very same physical signal, say a pattern of light, that carries no semantic information for a rock, because the rock has no interests and no actions available, carries minimal semantic information for a tree. Here, grow this way, more sunlight to the left, so very minimal instructive content, and moderate semantic information for a rat, but more trees, fewer predators, shelter there, and can carry much more for us. Saplings left, old growth right, this must have been where the old farm's boundary was, and so on, etc. But the idea here, encapsulated in this little story, and the thinking behind it, is that as long as it's just content modulated all the way down, I mean, not the first instance, the rock case seems to be a totally contentless story, so minds get into the grip, I guess, when, on this picture, even for trees, interesting. But wherever you put the boundary, you're going to get the story of the graduation. Okay. Positing psychological continuity actually has explanatory advantages over rep, because doing so allows for a homogeneous tale to be told about the evolution of cognition. That does not need sophisticated account of spontaneous generation of an elaborate discourse. So the idea being somehow, on our model, we somehow spontaneously we could explain the emergence of content at some moment and therefore committed to something like this, whereas the other account doesn't have this kind of awkward problem. Highly evolved languages and measuring devices, therefore, are only very specialized and largely arbitrary realizations of much simpler and more universal functional principles by which we should define language and measurements. So they think this is the quorum sensing in bacteria and all sorts of other things exhibit exactly the same set of properties, that we just have a more elaborate version of the same thing. That's the idea. And they have posed this, what they now call, we used to have a problem in the last book called the scaling up objection, and now we face what they call the scaling down objection. So whatever it is that makes linguistic practices give rise to content should also give rise to content in waggle dancing, honeybees, quorum sensing in bacteria, and hormones in one's endocrine system. The scaling down problem is that there's no difference, there's no fundamental difference in kind in any of these cases. To the extent that content is naturally explicable, naturally occurring property of any and all of these, any kind of mind, then it must be present, at least in some modest form, in any and every mind. So insofar as it's there, as count these as minded, if you have the content involving you, then you're going to see there's always some form of content there. And that that is precisely what unrestricted would have demanded anyway. So remember, unrestricted kick holds that all minds are contentful to some degree. Human minds are contentful in unique, special, expressive ways, perhaps. Or if you go back to Millikan, there's like 6 degrees of important difference between us and other animal minds. But those are not different in respect to being contentful, in respect to other cognitive properties that the systems may have on this model. So human minds are contentful in unique and especially impressive ways. That's the idea. Complex agents evolve incrementally from simpler ones, says Kim Strelny. And here's Kim, assuming biosemantics, once the origins of our scaffolding practices are explained and how they work and what their effects are, we are done from that of explaining intentional content, because intentional content was already in place. The scaffolding just enhances the capacities around the edges. We don't have to think of how content got in on the act earlier on. The assumption is it's always there to some degree. So Kim tries to call on Ruth Millikan's theory of semantics to explain how you could have content all the way down, and I won't have time to get into it today because I'll need to speed through this. But we're going to assume that Millikan's story doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't have to work, it just doesn't work. It doesn't deliver the package of a semantic theory of content, which creates a problem for this particular way of understanding the content view. Of course, you can bring in an alternative theory of content, but please, or know that works. As far as I know, this was the best story that we currently have, or one of the very often agreed upon as being one of the best. So I don't know anyone who has a ready-made theory of content that could replace it to do the work that's needed in this kind of cases. In fact, most theorists, Kim himself, appeal to this as the way to solve the problem. But if it doesn't work, then we have a problem that's quite severe. You could go the other way too, right? You could just go the other way and say, look, let's call it autopoietic sense-making all the way up and all the way down. Let's assume that there isn't really representational content, and what is similar between us in continuity-wise is that we're no different from these quorum sensing systems. They don't represent the world in a truth-conditional way, but however they do it, we're just more elaborate versions of what they do. Our ways of making sense are not really importantly different. So you get this a lot from enactivists, other enactivists. Cognitive interactions include, for example, a bacterium's ability to sense the concentration of sucrose in the immediate environment and to move itself accordingly. Down to the simplest organisms, life is always minded, and the richer the living form, the richer its mind. So again, we have an elaboration story that just tells you there's no significant or fundamental difference. We find the mindedness in the living systems, and that's the same going all the way up. So you didn't be a representationalist in order to embrace this kind of continuity thesis. So you have two extremes, two psychological continuity choices, it seems. A content everywhere view, which is unrestricted kick, okay, see, and content nowhere view, really wreck, or something like computational only cognition or something of this kind, where we simply say there is no content story, and therefore we have continuity, but the continuity has a different, something else explains the feature. So I will hurry along. The positions are something like this. You have continuity on this side, unrestricted, or really wreck, which you deny that there is any content anywhere in the story, and our position, basic minds that don't have content, and at the base, and then other minds, just using those two books as signatures, contentful, bound up with narratives and other things, and we seem to introduce this break. How to get around it, or can we? Is a gapless account of evolutionary continuity possible without assuming psychological continuity? Does evolutionary continuity actually entail psychological continuity? I don't think so. And so have other authors who made the same claim. The conviction that there must be some diachronic emergence story encourages proponents of continuity to overinterpret the behaviors of existing animal species and to underplay some of the evidently unique features of human thought and language. And indeed, in a paper, in a BBS paper on Darwin's mistake, the authors themselves press for the idea that we really have to break with this mantra, this line out of Darwin, and accept that there really is manifest functional discontinuity between extended human and non-human minds that could have evolved in a biologically plausible manner. And so not doing that is to these points of continuity. Now, should we make of this claim that Darwin says there's not a difference in kind, but only of degree? Tim Craig makes, on just this issue, makes an excellent point. He says, he cautions, we must be careful to specify what we mean by fundamental degree and kind when speaking of fundamental differences, kind, not degree. And in this case, he says, quote, if a fundamental difference is just an important difference or a significant difference or scientifically or philosophically interesting difference, Darwin's claim is surely not true. Because there are fundamentally new properties that come into the mix, and they transform the capacities of the systems in question. And doing so, now the last, I'm going to sum them down to these last five, I'll be very quick. How do we get this in without breaking? If that's the story, then how do we avoid this problem about the break in the world? And our solution is, I hope, simple and elegant, and I can tell it to you quickly. We go for kinks, not breaks. So this is where our explanations get kinky, as we put it. So Rex preferred diachronic explanation of the natural origins of content in the natural is kinky. The Knox story doesn't play out along a single linear dimension. It's not just a story of mere elaboration of existing forms, which is what they seem to demand in order not to have a gap in nature. It doesn't see all cognitive properties as just more complex versions of what has come before. That's the important feature. It is a multi-story story, one that stars socio-cultural platforms and constructions. So whereas our opponents of both stripes, whether you're a representationalist or not a representationalist, give us a single story along one dimension, we do this. That's not a break. It's a kink, and we can have lots of kinks if we want it in the story. If we look at hominid evolution, of course, I think this is just illustrative. I'm not going by cranial sizes or such like, but although they do get these spikes, you get a kind of kinked account at different points, and tied up with, say, the growth of tool industry. We might think, if we had more time, I could elaborate it, that this comes in steps, sort of imaginative capacities come on the scenes of human beings, that leaps up. Then we have other social-culturally based capacities for proto-languages, and that kinks up, and then we get another bounce. And that looks relatively like a good track record for what's been going on in our prehistory. So that's our solution. Rex is a tale of the natural origins of content involving thought is one of cognitive niches and how they scaffold and introduce novel cognitive features and capacities. Social cultural practices introduce something genuinely new into the cognitive mix, something that is not just more of the same. Through enculturation, cognizers come to be able to think about the world in wholly novel ways that are transformative of their cognitive capacities. And in the same way, without any mystery, we might think, even if the basis of mind is all interactive, what you're interacting with shapes and transforms those interactions in important ways and gives them new dimensions. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say something about the salvationist objection. Why I don't see that as a problem for naturalism at all. I believe the crust of the issue, cognitive scientists Giles Laponia and Mark Kerner have called the cause effect fallacy. Is the idea that if you have a small causal modification, you're going to have a small effect in comparison. But we have several examples, for instance, in evolutionary genetics, where that is not really the case. You can have a single point mutation giving rise to an enormous phenotypical effect. And there's also precedence for that kind of dramatic change in the theories of some of the foremost hardcore Darwinians. So, for instance, in Van Danen's theory of consciousness, you have language contributing to extreme ball-wing effects in neuronal architecture and reorganizing the brain in dramatic ways, in which case those that are not cultures are not bound to have this sort of organization. And the other example that I have, kinds of kinks, as we put it, seem to be really real in the context of human prehistory. So we have, for instance, talk about the Great Leap Forward.
Yes.
This is a narrow event about 50,000 years ago where it appears that we have the emergence of symbolic representation. We have and complex religious practices all appearing at the same time.
Okay, so I like everything you're saying, of course. So let me, since I'm not going to be able to argue against you there because I don't want to, let me try and give you something that Kim Sarelny said when I was at ANU, because he just thinks that those are all artifacts of the fossil record. So what looks like to be these great leaps forward and changes may just be that we're missing the accurate fossil record that fills in the continuous gaps, right? So he thinks that that could be, you know, there could be just straight up continuity here. There's not these great moments of change and punctuation, right? It may well just be that we're tricked into this. Just a note, just a comment. If you separate the ontogeny from the phylogeny, as he hopes to as well, then the problem will be that even if we find there's these great transformations in ontogeny, we can't infer safely that that will be true. I'm just giving you the answer for the opponents. They're not going to take the fossil record or the archaeological record at face value. But the point about biology is separate from that. I know, I understand.
I believe that there is tension on something like human exceptionalism.
Yes.
If that entails human exceptionalism, but this sort of human exceptionalism not only seems to be entirely consistent with a neo-Darwinian naturalism,
yes,
but it seems to be empirically adequate.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I should invite you to my house to sing at dinner time, because that's the idea. But of course, this has been the problem, and I think, because I agree, but I mean, I do understand that there will be challenges from the empirical record and largely empirical challenges. They didn't believe that we hadn't answered the problem in what we'd said. That wasn't the idea, that maybe the record itself doesn't show that there is, in fact, these weren't, in fact, as we would have it. So when I showed that particular slide that you're talking about, you'll get the same kind of result. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I think I simply favor this line of reading that fits the story. What I want to say was, yeah, the flip side is the unpleasant. You have to make a choice there. I like putting it this way. Either the bacteria, if you go that way, has got to have, or wherever you draw the line for content to get in the story, even the simplest system is going to have fully propositional thinking or something like that, because we have it. Can't be a mere elaboration, and therefore you have to explain how it gets in on the story for the continuity, or you just deny that we can have content for clause. If you go for that extreme view of continuity that implies something about content, so that's seemingly philosophically motivated, not empirically motivated, and problematic for a lot of reasons. So I take the point of your question, well, comment really.
Yeah. Thanks for your talk. Very clear and illuminating. I don't have a bunch of questions. I'll go for the most thought-provoking.
Okay.
First, I like the general idea, but I have a problem with it, and I'll go for a strong criticism here.
Okay.
It seems a schematic form of dualism in content, substitute the soul somehow. So my first question, based on the strong criticisms, where in the phylogenetic tree appears contempt? First question, two. Second question is just a question of clarification. Would you define for us clear, fast, formally, but precisely your definition of intentionality and contempt? That will be a very important step to understand the extent of the risk of your claim in terms of defining these borderlines.
Yeah.
And the third question is, that's it's also very important to understand the whole picture. What is exactly the relationship between content and semantic capacities? Because I quite do not understand what it's trying to there. And the fourth comment, it's not a question, is I really felt the lack of the word consilience. The same, even in the sense of real or original meaning, or in the sense of Edward Wilson, the idea that we have consilience between sciences, and there's no clear word line between physical, biological, and whatever, cultural science, social sciences. We have to establish consilience between
connections.
Consilient lines between,
Okay, yeah, connections I think are entirely fine. Reductions are something else. Okay, so just start with that. I mean, backing through the questions. Let me just give you some gesture about content. Look, that's why I spent a little time in the talk saying what I meant by content, and it's quite broad, and it's not as fast and frugal as you'd like, perhaps, but the core of it is, I think, fine. It was pretty much captured by the Travis quote. I could give you actually endless authors who make the same point. It's the same notion. So I think it's picking out something in the philosophical literature that is actually very robust. And although they vary it, they're saying that there's some way that the world is specified as being such that the world may not be that way. Now you can, if you're Tim Crane, you can have accuracy conditions, or if you were like the old traditionalists, you have truth conditions, or you might have veridicality conditions, and you can loosen up some of the other features of this. But the idea is that there's a way things are taken to be, I mean, they use a lot of metaphors, taken to be such that they may not be that way. They have the world in a certain view. Usually elocution is something like, the world is replicated. We're taking that as standard. You find this in Frege, you find this in Fodor, you find this in truth conditional theories of, anyway, standard disputational theories of truth have the same kind of properties. So I think that's certainly not for me to say, like, I'm not trying to say this is we've, used. I think if you haven't, if you're familiar with the analytic literature, you're already familiar with this notion.
Yeah.
It's actually, I think, Pettit and Jackson at one point say, content is a technical term of art, but it's one that we're familiar with in analytic philosophy, right? So it's the analytic notion, and it's widespread. I don't think, if you want to discuss that further, we could, but I just think it's a losing game, because I actually have a collection of quotes, just don't have time to put them up.
But you still have to respond to these guys. There are people who are talking about biosemantics, content in biosemantics and teleosemantics, but we don't have to answer the analytic tenets anymore.
No. Nope. Let me respond to that. Millikan takes the notion. Millikan takes the notion of a push me pull you to have truth conditional content straight up, and she says what she's after there is to even give you the grounds for theory of truth. That's no different. That's not a different notion. That's my point. The notion and I can take you through the textbooks of cognitive science. They're borrowing the same notion. This is not different. Rascola, recent papers, Bechtel, recent papers, Brancato, I think, is a book. I can do George Ray, Jerry Fodor. I mean, I could just go on for a long time and just find you this notion. It's not a cooked up, strange thing, because this is often what people want to say. You're making a notion of content in an argument against it. No, I don't buy that for a minute. You'd have to prove that in a court of law and show me that, in fact, this isn't the standard notion that everyone is applying. When we use the content vehicle distinction, that's, in fact, what they are in book. So the extension is you take it from language to an intentionality all those years ago. Now, here's the important point. The point is right. What is, and we have to spend some time in the book, and I didn't get to do that in this presentation, and I can't do the elaborate version here, but there is a notion, I think, of intentionality, older, different, and that we can unpack, that's directed at the world in some respect, that targets it without representing it as such, is the idea. And that you preserve this notion, and it has value to do so. It doesn't have all those, doesn't demand all those high-end and demanded properties that we just talked about. And once you separate those two things, your explanatory resources is increased, I think, powerfully. I hope at the book launch I can say a little bit about that, because I think it will make it a lot easier to see what the proposal is for the base and why it's improved. But we do talk about intentionality in the book, and that's what we try to unpack it. And it's still unfolding. We're still working that idea through. But I think that is one of our signature points. And most people have run those things together because they assume that wherever there's intentionality, and this goes back to John Searle, wherever there's intentionality, you're getting the properties. When we express ourselves in language, those properties are being expressed by the basic mental content, which is there prior, and the language is expressing it, and then it derives from just the same. And it's that idea that's problematic. Okay, so those are two things. I didn't know if there was...
The hard questions, where in the phylogenetic tree appears content, and why your position is not a schematic form of dualism, where content substitutes the soul somehow.
Man, I don't know why I would be stuck with that last thing about dualism. That would take a longer time. I sure hope that's not right. I do remember...
It's a kind of a histrionic version of his question.
No, I thought his question was...
A very anthropocentric view of the world, where content represents actual properties of
I didn't think that question was so much against us. It allowed us to say, I misunderstood that. I thought the story there was, there wasn't anything wrong about this. The saltation is right. And although I'm happy with that, we don't need to give an answer we don't have to give an answer. I think the argument was something like this. And I take it. Saltationism is a bad argument anyway. But anyway, we can defeat it. We didn't defeat it that way because we think there is, in fact, a very staged and progressive way in which and there are changes that go with that. But I don't think that's
just referring
soul-based.
I just say you divide the word now between where content is not present and where content is present. That's a form of dualism, and I really see the schematic resemblance with the soul.
Why should that? Souls don't come into that at all. Whatever.
So is where content is in evolving intentionality, for example. If you see Solaris, or if you see St. Thomas, content is in the soul in the sense.
Yeah, but I don't have to agree with Thomas.
Okay.
Right? Unless you show me an argument that shows that it entails that if I mention content, Jerry Fodor mentions content. So he's also so anyone who mentions. So I think that's going to take us a long way.
So what about where content appears in the phylogenetic tree? I would be happy to.
Because we have another question,
With scaffolded linguistic practices, that's my answer, but I'll leave it for now for the next question.
Okay.
Well, come on, say
it.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't know I was a soul man, but I'm happy.
Talking about souls and that's question.
I thought the notion of content in a different way. So I thought it was something special about Travis's notion. Because Travis thinks that we actually acquire knowledge, and there's knowledge of language in a gradual way. There's some qualitative change from language user, or proficient language user, and learning. So I was wondering whether you were actually using a notion of content that was similar like that. So whether you posit something like analytic constraints or something like that, or you kind of say, no, there's no such grand general requirement on content use, but rather
a gradual, like
something analytic, what Travis also holds for language.
This is just me, though. I mean, there'll be other versions of our account that could go a different way. So I'm more attracted to the second thought. Not that there's the generality constraint is the marker of, that we have some simple criteria. There are moments where I'm attracted to the thought that, you're able to enter into these kind of practices. You master them slowly. Same like mastering other skills, and we can't say precisely like when is somebody a competent driver, right? When they are competent to use these ideas. You're going to find an inexactitude about this. I think that's the position that I'm happiest with. So I mean, I need to have some powerful arguments for why we take one criteria over the others. But I think this is quite yeah, if you buy the thought that you can come in, enter into this, you know, if I use the language space of reasons for a moment, just to be simpler, you enter into language in the space where you get a capacity that's not an exact moment on the 4th birthday. And in fact, my book on folk psychological narratives is really an extended love song to that idea. So there's a whole story of very gradual, stepwise capacities coming together and getting kind of integrated over time.
Here about content, it's not something that is compositional.
Yeah, so I have said little. I mean, all I said is identified its very core basic properties and that such a thing exists, okay? Like I think of these as strange entities or on the model of an object or, you know, invoking, I hope not invoking dualism. I think you can. I don't think Davidson talks of content. I don't think he's a dualist. You have a very minimal take on truth, etc., and interpretive practices, right? So I think there's plenty of ways in which we can make sense of this idea without going that road. But there are content deniers, right, out and out. Rosenberg, for example, who just think there is no content in the world. So completely their scientific agendas. So there's plenty of people who think we shouldn't trouble ourselves with these notions. They bring in problems about normativity that other people want to avoid, right? So, but I think the spelling out of these other properties is, you know, there's many ways that could be done, and that would take a longer argument. But I happen, as it happens, to prefer that more Travis-like. Yes.
Thank you. Let's thank you. I will invite you for the coffee break outside. You can discuss for 10 minutes and then 11:50. 10 minutes. For whatever it is.
Sorry, I was going to the break. The only thing I was slowing down is I kept stepping out of the frame, so I don't know how that was performing well or not. I was cutting my head off, but when I back up,
It's a very nice story.
yeah, it's fun talk. I mean, it's one of the signature chapters. No, I'm not the talk. I just wanted to spoil. I felt back. I stood back. So that watching the picture.
So, how can we organize it? Because we're not prepared for this presentation.
But we could always, at the worst case, we could always do a voiceover.
So we can refine something and then learn from this experience. And also, you can
just cut some of the, like on my head is on. You can interrupt me. I don't know.
maybe educate with your
Yeah. Well, we can just use that well. This is a better book. Yeah, maybe play my part.
Fez a transição? Não, estamos fazendo a transição, tá aqui. Certo, tá ao vivo. Ao vivo, eu vou finalizar. Só para deixar aqui. Nós não sabemos como é que tá lá. Porque eu não sei se você já fez isso aqui pelo grupo, pelo YouTube. Pelo YouTube não. Deixa curtindo pelo YouTube. Conhece o Hangout? Sim. Pois é, o YouTube você conecta com o Hangout automático. Tá pegando essa câmera aqui, ó. Certo, né? Agora, está lançando, tá jogando, né? A gente não sabia se a rede estava com uma taxa suficiente para a gente não sabe o resultado. Tu acessou o YouTube para ver? Não. A gente estava mas a gente pode acessar. Vamos fazer um teste. Porque assim, eu vou encerrar aqui a introdução.